Okay.
Oh, it's streaming live. Oh, geez, I didn't realize it was live.
Yep, we're live now. I'm about to introduce you. Okay. Hi, I'm Meta Spencer. Let's talk about Caribou and Wolverines, shall we? Or more generally, let's talk about predation and carnivorism. Carnivorism. And we've got somebody here who knows a lot about that subject. This is Justina Ray, who is, I think, Canadian Wildlife Association. That's probably not the title. Give me the proper title of your outfit.
So I'm the president and senior scientist of Wildlife Conservation Society Canada. You can find us at wcscanada.org.
Excellent.
And we're an organization of conservation scientists. We do field research and bring expertise to bear on land use and policy decisions around Canada.
Okay, that is just a terrific topic. I'm not too familiar with it, but I can tell you right now it's bound to be important. So Justina Ray is somebody who I came at from being interested in mass timber, but I don't think that's your specialty. I talked to the people in Mass Timber Institute, and they mentioned your name as somebody who has thoughts about it. And I think the connection is, as I understand it, you're concerned about or have issues about the relationship between caribou and forestry. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, I have nothing against mass timber at all, but when the origin of timber is always the forests, and so we have to think about the critters in the forest and what are the impacts of that extraction, and of course that's part and parcel of all forestry that is done in Canada, in the sense that management of and planning of forestry has to take into account these other dimensions, the ecological dimensions and of other species that are part of the forest ecosystem.
Okay, well, here, let me toss something at you and see if it sticks, as I say about throwing things at walls. There's an interview I did a few weeks ago with a guy whose name I can't recall offhand, but he wrote a wonderful book called Tree Line. And it was about a trip he took around the Arctic in all of the countries surrounding the North Pole and that have land in the Arctic, and trying to see what's going on there. And I guess one of the main concerns he has is that trees are growing where they don't belong, or whether they didn't belong before. And so he reports on all of these different countries. They're very interesting because they're different species that predominate in each of these countries. And of course, they have different ecological impacts. But one of the things, at least for the Lapps, the Lappish people who were herders of reindeer, or still are, but they think they're not going to be able to continue it much longer. Because as he put it, and I hope I'm correctly sort of characterizing what he says, the problem is that the warming climate means that there are trees growing in the Arctic where the reindeer are not used to it. And they get tangled up in these forests. They can't find their way. They're used to being out on an open space with ice and snow. And he says that the rain then also falls on the ice and it melts and then freezes on top of the ice, on top of the snow. And the reindeer need to eat grass all winter. So what they do is kick the snow aside and eat the grass. So if there's ice there, they can't get at it. And that is causing great hardships. And he thinks, I hope this is the correct way he means for it to be described, but it sounds as if this is going to be the end of reindeer herding in the Arctic. Does that sound like anything that makes sense to you?
There's elements of that that are certainly the case. I mean, so first I'll take the issue of the forests, the boreal, what's happening with forests in the Arctic. It is certainly true that there is some changes happening to the tree line, as is the theme of that book. In fact, a study just came out yesterday that's showing this at a grand scale, that there have been these shifts have taken place already, but they are still pretty small in the scheme of things. And reindeer are caribou. It's all the same species. They behave and have different ecology in different parts of the world. But most of them, especially even those that are in Arctic areas, do use forests. So the notion of them getting tangled up in forests is probably not so much the case as is because they'll be using those habitats at the same time. But the issue of their food availability with changing weather patterns is absolutely true. And in many cases, we've already discovered in remote areas mass die-offs of caribou because they starve. And in the conditions that might foster this is, for example, rain on snow events, where you'll get a rain that's happening uncharacteristically in the middle of the winter. It'll hit the tundra, it'll freeze, and the reindeer and caribou have these very sharp hooves. They often.
I've lost your sound. I've lost your sound. Can't hear you. I can't hear you.
How about right now?
Oh, now, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I don't know what happened, but we'll just have to continue. Sometimes the connection is unstable, unfortunately. But the rain on snow events. So when rain comes on in a snow, and it will freeze the snow. And then reindeer and caribou use hooves, sharp hooves, to dig under. And if it's all frozen, they can't do that. And so these mass die-offs have occurred. Whether or not that means that they will not be able to survive is still not sure. But certainly these reindeer herders require a ton of land. And the other issue that's a problem is where there's development that precludes these movements that are required. These caribou range over very large areas. And when you've got development in the way, that's another issue that's a problem for the future.
Yeah, expand on that. I'm not the
development like oil and gas, like mining, things like that. So where the other uses of the land that might get in the way of movements or calving areas of caribou and reindeer and so forth.
I see. Well, are you finding that there's enough development of that kind? I mean, when I look at the map of the Arctic, it looks like one big empty place, but is there enough development going in there to actually interrupt their movements if they need to travel around?
In some places, yes, absolutely. And it all depends on the herd itself. So whatever herd, they have their area. And if you've got developments like oil and gas or mines or roads, that can be very problematic for that particular herd. Other areas, there isn't much development, but there's quite a bit of interest. And so we're concerned about the future and how that will unfold. And in some areas, it will be more of a concern than others.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, what you've said already puts a damper on one of my causes in life. I have jumped on a bandwagon without really checking it out because I was so impressed with the things that I have been reading about a place called Pleistocene Park in Siberia, where a father and son have fenced off a large park area and are trying to fill it with large animals. And the father is a person who's been studying the Arctic maybe all his life. He's a real scientist. And the son is helping him run his outfit now. but the father believes that the melting permafrost is probably, and I can't disagree with him, mankind's greatest threat, even worse than some of the other aspects of our global warming problem that may be the most serious. And then as this permafrost melts, the bacteria from rotting vegetation that melts, bacteria create methane emissions that
Yes.
methane and hydrogen dioxide, obviously. So their solution, and the only thing they can think of that would really make a difference, is to repopulate the Arctic with large animals that during the Pleistocene period actually did inhabit the Arctic in huge numbers, millions and millions of these mammoths and other great big megafauna. So they go around collecting moose and elk and everything they can find that's big, and try to bring them in and hope that they will repopulate. And so then they measure the temperature of the soil. And their argument, as I understand it, is that animals, of course, have to eat in the winter. They go around kicking the snow aside to get at the frozen grass underneath. And so this kicking it aside means that the temperature of the soil underneath is remains colder where they've kicked it aside, because the snow acts as a blanket, an insulation blanket. So kicking it aside creates colder soil. And of course, then they trample on it and mash the snow down and stuff. So the whole thing is, it reduces the temperature of the soil on a pretty big scale. And of course, if you have the bigger the herds and the bigger the animal, the more they do that. And one of their other side effects, or maybe it's an essential component of this theory, is that the animals also knock over young saplings so that the trees can't grow. And the people there actually are using their own, machinery, their cars and other old equipment, to go around and knock down trees as much as they can, because they think that the trees warm the soil and do great harm to our prospects. So I find this such a convincing thing, and I've read a little bit about other people who've checked it out, and it's apparently has some foundation. Tell me what you think about this.
Yeah, so I have not read very much or looked into this particular idea. Certainly, it is true that the permafrost melting is a deep problem, but the whole notion of sort of bringing in other animals into an area where they haven't been, hoping that this will then have an alternative future, is something I have some sympathy for. But I wouldn't want to put my own energy into that as much as I would in terms of trying to prevent some of the forces that are causing the permafrost melting in the first place. So I do think that we have to spend a lot of energy ourselves into still fighting climate change, and ensuring that some of these changes that are happening are not inevitable. Certainly adaptation is in order, but I would spend more time focusing on maintaining natural areas so that they can evolve with the changes that climate brings in, rather than bringing in and manipulating systems in the way that you've described. But I'd have to look at it a little bit more. Mm-hmm. So I'm not gonna get rid of the idea at all. There's probably a lot of good foundation to it, but it's a lot about what solutions each of us sort of works on the most and makes the most difference in this sort of broader, complicated equation.
Mm-hmm. Well, one of the things I frequently do, about once a month, I have a show with a man named Peter Wadhams, who's a an expert at he's a professor at Cambridge University, and he's the leading expert or one of the leading experts on Arctic sea ice. And he and another guy named Paul Beckwith, who's a climatologist in Ottawa, both come on my show and talk about the current situation. Now, the thing that I've learned from them and a number of other people that I've interviewed is that this is such an emergency, and that the efforts to reduce the use of fossil fuels, while it is absolutely fundamental, there is no question that that is what we really have to do, but that can't do it fast enough. That even if we shut off the use of fossil fuels today, the temperature
there will be changes.
And therefore there's it. Even I think the IPCC has acknowledged that there has to be some kind of negative emissions policy where there's an effort not only to stop emitting more carbon, but actually to suck carbon out of the atmosphere somehow. And that can be done by trees and agriculture and a number of other things.
And this is such a big issue that each of us has to work on different aspects of it, right? We cannot give up on the fossil fuel reduction. That absolutely has to happen. And, there are ways for that to turn around. But my role in particular on the nature side, and those of my colleagues and so on, is about focused on keeping the trees and peatlands and natural systems in as good a shape as possible so that they can be more resilient to changes that come. Because the service that trees keep doing and peatlands and so forth are absolutely fundamental for surviving, for the planet's survival into the future on climate change.
Okay, I hear I must say scientists don't necessarily all agree. In fact, I think the one thing that I've learned is how much more research is really needed on some of these extremely important issues, like the role of trees in the Arctic, because it's pretty clear that at least some trees in the Arctic actually have a warming effect, even though, of course, they sequester carbon. They actually, because of albedo effect and other things, they actually warm the soil more than they cool it. But the question I've tried to ask a dozen people probably who should know about this, but they don't. Is it true? I mean, they don't know what the answer is, because I don't think the work has been done enough to establish the answer. Which trees, or do all trees, or trees where? And is it trees just in permafrost, or is it trees in permafrost anywhere? Is it all trees in the boreal forest? I can't get answers to that.
Well, because they're all going to be different answers for all of those. It's scale dependent. Yeah. You started out talking about trees in the Arctic, but it's more fundamental for trees below the Arctic and in boreal forests, and the broader service is still very fundamental over large areas in terms of that they are still absorbing carbon to an important event. I mean, one of the things that we're spending a lot of our energy on is peatland systems, where a lot of the carbon is stored below ground. Mm-hmm. And the issue is not so much how much are they actively absorbing now, but how much is at stake if those peatland systems get converted. So, for example, if a mine or a road or something like that can unleash, thousands of years of built up carbon underneath the soil. And so from the standpoint of ensuring that doesn't happen and exacerbate the problem, we really have to focus a lot on conservation of those larger peatland systems, of which the boreal forest is very important. Mm-hmm. Canada has 25% of the global peatland, of the global share of peatland. So Canada is very important in this equation in particular.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Now, again, here's another place where I'm confused. And I have actually phoned experts in a kind of an emergency situation before I went on a show trying to find out what's the real answer. Because wetlands are a source of methane emissions. Rice and other swamps and things. So they emit too. The question is, yes, you say that you're not worried so much about the present sequestering of carbon, but maintaining the stockpiles of carbon that's already there in the peatland. I wanted to know whether anybody is sure whether the wetlands are emitting more carbon than they are sequestering now. And
So
I
you're
can't
talking about
guarantee-
wetlands and peatlands sort of synonymously, and peatlands are a type of wetland, but they're very, very specific type of wetland that's quite different from, you can't talk generically about wetlands in general, it's peatlands specifically. And there is very good evidence showing that in some where they're not be converted for other uses, that while some emissions are coming out because of weather patterns and fire and so forth, that in some they're still in net sink situation where they're still absorbing more carbon than they're emitting. Mm-hmm. But that's at large scales, and that's at northern peatlands in general, in Canada. For example, but in some areas where peatlands are actively being mined for horticulture purposes, or for, like in Europe, or in southern parts of Canada, or the southern part of boreal systems, in places where you might build a road across a peatland system, that's where you've got to be worried. The other place you got to be worried is in peatlands in permafrost, right? There is more concern about that there is net emission happening even under quote unquote natural circumstances. But many of the northern peatlands are not in permafrost situation. And those are the ones in particular where they are still actively absorbing carbon.
Okay, well, that's as close to a definitive answer as I've got so far. Thank you for that. I like.
And you invited me on for caribou.
Yeah, now we can get back to our original topic. I want to hear about the caribou. Tell me about why. I mean, you told me a few minutes ago that you actually got interested in caribou from studying wolverines, and so tell me more about how this thing happened. But maybe first tell me what we should all know about caribou. Why should we care about caribou?
Well, caribou are on the quarter, and they're on the quarter for a reason. They have this incredible tie to humans, since humans have been in Canada. Many Indigenous peoples across have deep relationships with caribou that are either historical but go on to this day, particularly in the very far northern areas. Very dependent on caribou for subsistence, but also culturally, these are cultural keystone species. And so caribou themselves are kind of a symbol of ecosystem health wherever they occur. In the Arctic systems, in boreal systems, in montane systems, they're kind of a symbol of the North. And they're so sensitive to disturbance, climate change, and so forth, that they're a good barometer, like a canary in the coal mine, for understanding, if they're not faring well, then the system isn't faring well for certain reasons. Either we're damaging it too much through development and so on, or the climate is changing, other reasons, right? So caribou are a very good barometer for for ecosystem health. They're a good symbol of wilderness, which Canada is known for. They need a lot of space. They are majestic in their movements and behavior. They're unbelievable in the sense of when they get together in large numbers. It's one of the most extraordinary wildlife spectacles that some people are very lucky to have witnessed. And so there's all those reasons for why they're important, why we should care.
Okay, but what's the problem now? I hear that, we've got to worry about them because life is tough for a caribou now.
Well, they're very adapted to northern environments, and we've been talking about climate change, so there are concerns that their environments are changing from climate-related matters. These everything from weather patterns, as we've discussed, to just sort of changes that have happened to vegetation and snow cover and so forth. But we're also in the southern part of the range is where we've done a lot of damage just on our own without climate, and that's through habitat clearing of forests, through forestry, hydro development in certain cases, oil and gas significantly, particularly in the West, where we've removed habitat, we've put in roads, and they have lost about 40% of their previous range in the south, all across Northern America. So they used to occur in part in many of the states like Maine, New Hampshire, Minnesota, Idaho, Washington State, and so forth. They don't occur there at all. So they're not in any of the states anymore. And in Canada, they're like in Ontario, for example, their ranges receded. They used to be as far south as Lake Nipissing, and they're now closer to Lake Nipigon. So, you know, they've lost quite a bit of their range over a period of about 150 years. And that's due to the combined effects of habitat clearing, but also at one time over hunting too.
And it's not strictly from global warming.
Not at all. No, that is now, global warming is now really taken hold and become an issue more now in the last decade or so. And we're very worried about the exacerbating impacts of climate change in the future.
Okay, now are they needed for maintenance of some other features of the ecology? In other words, if we lose caribou, who's going to care? I mean, what difference is it going to make in the rest of the world?
Particularly in Arctic systems where caribou naturally occur in very large herds. They are an important ecosystem player in the sense that they bring nutrients in, through they're also important prey for predators, and their presence in the landscape is so dominant that there are consequences when they're not there. They're also very important, as I said, for Indigenous peoples in terms of both subsistence, food, culture, and many of the herds which have declined hugely in the last 2 decades. That's had enormous consequences culturally for many of the Indigenous nations that are across in particularly in NWT, in Nunavut, and in Yukon as well, and Alaska.
Mm-hmm. I was not aware that there are many Indigenous tribes in Canada actually depend on caribou. Of course, we hear about the Lapps in Scandinavia. That's all I think of. If I hear about somebody refer to people depending on, I guess in Siberia, there are people who also, tribes of people or traditional groups that depend on reindeer.
Those are very different systems. They're semi-domesticated, so they follow those reindeer throughout their entire life, and they are what you would call semi-domesticated. So they're allowed to roam, but they are really under the control of people, and that's been a relationship that's been for many years. In Canada and Alaska, it's not like that. It's not like herding. The dependence is much more a natural predator-prey system where the caribou are entirely wild, and the people have learned to move with those herds over the years, but not so lockstep as you might see in with Sami reindeer herders and so forth in Eurasia. It's quite a different system. It's much more natural, wild, and so the dependence has to do with a cultural dependence. Dependence is not a great word for it. I mean, it's really just this relationship that's quite intricate that I really can only speak to from observation, but not myself. You would have to have somebody else on the show talking about that, but that's certainly as important, but quite different in its expression.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so the future of Indigenous populations in northern Canada does not depend on the future of the caribou in maybe to the same degree as would be the case for the Sami in Scandinavia and Siberia.
Well, I wouldn't make that generalization. I would say that there would be many who would say that the future would be different without caribou. It already is. Mm-hmm. There is a significant relationship, but I don't want to speak so much for that, because that's I'm only observing that. I'm not living that myself.
Okay. Well, I think that's all, very instructive and interesting. Now, I want to know how you got there, because as I
Sure.
understand it, you studied in Africa, studied carnivores in Africa, and this led you to reindeer.
Yeah, there is a sequence there. So I am a carnivore biologist. Like that was my first love. Carnivores being the order of mammals. There are about 270 mammals species, carnivore species in the world that range from weasels to bears, right? So those
No,
they're not.
you have to include people.
Well, no, the carnivore, the order is not, people are not included in that. It's a taxonomic order, right? And not everybody eats meat in that order. Like pandas are carnivora, but they eat entirely plant diet, right? And so it's not entirely about their diet, but it's an order of mammals. And so I did my PhD research in Central Africa, and in a small rainforest area around in Central African Republic. And I was there for 2.5 years in a field research station, quite remote from the nearest village, about 35 kilometers by logging road. And I studied the community of carnivores in that area. So leopards, civets, which don't exist in North America, mongooses, which also don't exist naturally in North America, and 2 species of cats, leopards, I think I mentioned, and then also golden cats. So there was a group of 8 carnivores that lived together. And I was investigating the ecology of these animals, what they ate, sort of a lot of fundamental biology about animals that had never really been studied before. I worked with Bayaka people, indigenous people in the area, on learning about these animals, catching them, putting radio collars on them, in a very remote situation. It was a very important learning experience, and I did my PhD thesis from these set of observations. So I'm an expert then in this sort of types of animals, many of which are endangered around the world. I came back to Canada in 1996, and started work up here. And the animal that fascinated me the most, that had the least amount of information, was wolverines. And because it had never been studied in the far north in Ontario. So I spent a couple of years visiting Indigenous communities, learning more about the relationship between community members and wolverines. People had trapped them for the fur, and there was cultural use of the fur. So, and I learned a lot about the habits of wolverine, how abundant they were. And then we followed that up with aerial surveys, where I went over the course of about 7 years in airplanes, small airplanes, traversing about 7,000 kilometers in the winter, looking for wolverine tracks across the 500,000 square kilometer area. So that's an area the size of Sweden.
Hold on, you mean you can, from an airplane, you can spot a wolverine track?
Yes, you absolutely can, especially like a small airplane. We went with Super Cubs, so very slow moving, and they have a turning radius. They almost are like a helicopter, but they're much quieter and easier to maneuver. And I didn't fly the plane. It was these pilots from Alaska who came, and they were both expert trackers. So they were pilots, and I was just an expert tracker. So the two of us would traverse these areas and find out where all the wolverine tracks are. And once you start looking for them, you find them. But the thing about that, it was just amazing. And I would see sometimes wolverines as well, extraordinary experiences. But I also saw lots of caribou, because this was in caribou country. And I became really fascinated by the caribou at the same time. We were counting caribou, we were visiting them. And I also did a project for the Ontario government, in which we used these planes to find all of the groups where they had radio-collared caribou, so that we could look and see how many were in the group. We counted them, how many calves there were, so we could sort of look at the population health at the same time. And it was through that experience that I became more and more interested in caribou at the same time as wolverine. Did some research associated with that, but also got very involved in policies around protecting their habitat and ensuring their recovery through government processes. And that set of experiences has taken me from sort of field biologist to actually working on policy related to safeguarding these animals.
Did you ever see them? Did you go visit them on the ground?
Absolutely. I mean, some of the most amazing experience. I've been very lucky to have witness some amazing wildlife spectacles. And that's what I have been able to see caribou as far as my eye can see from an airplane in all different directions with that big a group. And coming upon it is quite amazing because you'll see tracks first, and then the tracks sort of start to assemble. And then, you go over the hill, so to speak, although you're in an airplane, and there you will see in the distance that there's going to be a lot of caribou there. And then all of a sudden you're over them. And it's quite a treat because you haven't seen human sign for maybe sometimes hours. And then there you see this extraordinary spectacle of caribou as far as the eye can see. I am very lucky to have witnessed that because that kind of spectacle is not something you can take for granted anymore.
Okay. Now, presumably, the wolverines know where the caribou are too and are hot on their trail. Wolverines, I looked it up on Google, and it seems they're pretty vicious.
Well, yeah, they have a bit more of a vicious reputation than they deserve. It will astound you to know that wolverines they don't get much bigger in size than a medium-sized dog. So a big male will be about 18 kilograms at most. That's not very big, but they're extraordinarily tenacious in the sense that they live in northern Arctic and boreal environments. They're able to dig through ice, beaver houses, and so forth. They can hide food. They cache food that they've been able to get so that they can get to it later. They don't habitually hunt large animals. They're much smaller than caribou and moose, but they can bring them down. They're more likely to prey upon beaver size animals, but they also are they're able to crush bone. They have these tremendous teeth that allow them to be scavengers, but they have a bigger reputation for scavenging than they really actually do. They're more hunting, but they can bring down large prey, even as big as a moose. And I've witnessed that, not the actual.
Moose. Really?
Yeah, and I've seen the aftermath. One of these times it's hard to see the actual wolverine from the air because they're so elusive that I have been lucky enough to see it maybe 7 or 8 times, but you can't see them as easily as you can caribou. But one time,
not because if they're out on the snow, they're
by themselves. They're by themselves. They're by themselves. They don't live at very high densities. You can find their tracks, but they're long gone, right? So they live at very low densities. So they'd be very difficult. For every many hundred caribou, you'd get one wolverine in the same area, right? So that's very typical for carnivores. They live at naturally low densities compared to caribou and moose and so forth. So one time I was flying over and we saw a lot of tracks of wolverine, said, what is going on here? And then we came upon a wolverine that was standing there. Usually they flee as soon as an airplane comes, right? But this one was standing its ground so much that we were able to circle around it 11 or 12 times. And it would just sit there going, what are you doing? And it turned out that they had a kill right close by that they were guarding. It was a large male, but still, not a very big animal. And it was guarding this moose, and we couldn't see any wolf tracks around. So we couldn't verify for sure that it had killed it, but it was a fresh moose that it was guarding. It considered it its own, but it's like a tiny size compared to this large moose. But people have witnessed wolverine bringing down these animals. They're quite tenacious and very large
No, but you
much larger
say
in body.
this is one Wolverine,
Yeah,
not a
one
pack.
Wolverine. They don't have
And
packs of Wolverine. They're by
so
themselves
if
all
he
the
kills
time.
it, he's going to eat it all by himself. I mean, that's a big
He may
animal. I
not.
mean,
He may not eat the whole thing. He may leave it eventually. But there is no pack. It's not like wolves. Like wolves will bring down the animals as a pack, and they will eat it as a pack. But not Wolverines. Wolverines are by themselves, except when they have young. Right. So that's a whole different thing.
is there any fear of them? In other words, would they bite you if you landed?
Well, no, they would run away most likely. I mean, they would defend themselves if they were cornered, and it would probably not be a good thing. But overall, this is not an animal that people should fear. It's the other way around. Wolverines are much more persecuted by people than people are by wolverines. Wolverines have they have a reputation as being sort of voracious and mean, and they don't deserve that. They're an extraordinary survivor in tough, harsh environments. They deserve respect. And they're much smaller than most people realize. They're much smaller, and they're beautiful animals. And and they can do things that we can only dream of. So they deserve all respect.
I saw two photos that they didn't look like the same critter, so I don't know. One of them was looked like a maybe salt and pepper mixture of things, but the other one was black and white.
Yeah, they look kind of. They have some character. They look sort of like a cross between a small bear and a skunk, in terms of, But they've got beautiful coloring, and on the chest, the coloring, the pattern is quite unique. Such two individuals, such that when we set up a camera trap and we set it up so that Wolverine will be reaching for prey or something like that, and a camera will take a picture, we can tell whether that's Sue or Bob or Michael because of the pattern of the fur, and then also whether it's a male or a female, because if we can see, exposed from the front. But you have to set up the camera just so that it will it'll be able to take that picture.
Well, you make them sound as if they're not very common. That if
they're not common, of course not.
Yeah,
very few people have had the chance to see them in the flesh, a lot because they happen to live in areas that are quite remote from most people, right? They're in very, harsh areas, and yeah, so they're not common at all. And if you go look for them, the only time you'll really see sign of them is in the winter, when you can find snow tracks, but catching up with them is almost impossible. So we have trapped them, and in the sense, because we put radio collars on them, and that's the best time where we can actually see them. But then when we track them, the males have home ranges, individual home ranges, meaning areas that they wander in over the course of a year of 1,000 square kilometers. That, for such a small animal, that's an enormous piece of land, right? So they wander around these very large areas. I mean, tigers can have ranges that large.
But now, why are they so rare? Is it because are they changing numerically?
In some areas they have certainly changed, but they have always been rare. They are a naturally rare species, as many carnivores, as I explained. It has to do with, they are at the top of the food chain, and there isn't a lot of food in these areas. The productivity of these areas is not that high, so it can't support huge numbers of these animals. Wolves in these same landscapes are also at lower densities. They have lower pack size. It's not common to see pack sizes of more than 4 or 5, whereas you come down further south in terrain that you wouldn't find a wolverine in, the wolf packs can get much larger, and they live at higher densities.
Oh, okay. Do you also study wolves?
Well, you tend to see them. I don't study them as much as the other two, but they're carnivores. Yeah. So.
Okay. Now, when you are studying carnivores, I don't know what to ask you about carnivores. Why do we have them, and do we have to keep them? I
Oh
mean, I
yes,
think about you.
they're absolutely critical for regulating when we're in places where we don't have wolves or wolves at low densities or bears, you'll get out of control a growth of other things, which can have cascading effects. So, I mean, I'm simplifying the story a lot, but for example, you can have an overabundance of deer, which can then have impacts on vegetation, and other cascading impacts. So carnivores are very important as and predators for ecosystem health. Absolutely.
Hmm. Okay, because obviously the thing I worry about, if I were to worry, which I don't on this particular topic, would be villagers who, get eaten by, well, polar bears, for example. And, we have, what is it? Uh, Where's that community in the Canadian
Well,
Arctic?
that has happened, but it doesn't happen very often. And where there are where predators have caused harm to humans has been mostly in circumstances where they've been squeezed out themselves. They're or where they're on conflict with livestock. So particularly wolves do not survive in farmland because there's both perceived and some real concerns that they're going to eat the sheep and the goats and the cows and so forth. Generally speaking, where there is enough land and native prey, that won't be an issue. But where carnivores get squeezed, you'll have circumstances where you've got teenage bears, for example, who don't have a home range, and they'll wander around and they'll wander into towns and they'll get into trouble, into garbage, and people are very worried about them, and occasionally they will turn on a pet or a person or something like that. You do have a few circumstances, but it's way less than other dangers like car accidents and so on. I mean, they just reach a high profile, and it's mostly where we've squeezed out these predators, so they can live in amazing ways in among us. So for example, in Los Angeles, there's almost no natural habitat around Los Angeles, but they've managed to keep corridors in some areas. There are mountain lions living in these areas, and they've learned how not to hang about humans during the day. They do most of their movements at night so that they can stay away from humans. Same with coyotes. So they adapt around humans in ways that like would be flabbergasted to know about. There are stories of bears hibernating for the winter under people's front porches in suburbia, and the people will never know about it, right? The only reason we know about it is because we have got a caller. Didn't do this study, but a colleague of mine did. So they can adapt to us pretty well, but we don't have much tolerance for these animals, and it's at that time where things start to get into trouble.
Yeah, well, I have a monthly talk show, a global town hall, I call it, and there's a guy in California who joins it quite often. He's his fixation is on gray foxes, and he is creating habitat for gray foxes along. I think he said along a freeway. There's empty land someplace adjacent to a California freeway, and I guess he's going to, or he's busy fixing it into a place where they can survive well. Because he says gray foxes are very important. I don't know. They wouldn't be a carnivore though, would they?
Yes, they are. Foxes are red foxes and gray foxes. They don't get this far north. They're more of a southern species. So they poke into Ontario in the northwest part, and they're on Pelee Island, but that's almost the only places where you'll find gray foxes in Ontario. They're much more abundant in the States further south than they are in Canada.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, so you have, as a conservation person, you have a mission in life. And tell me what keeps you awake as you worry about your mission and your success in conserving wildlife.
Well, I mean, I'm kept increasingly awake by the climate and biodiversity crisis for sure, and the I mean, the scientific knowledge of how how species are faring, and even what to do is pretty solid. We know enough about what to do, but similar to sort of some of what we've experienced during COVID, science isn't always followed for policies and so on. So that's the kind of thing I worry that it's getting more and more important, but we're less and less willing, perhaps, as a society to put limits on our behavior and development and so forth. But there is solutions, and so we have to keep fighting for them and keep making the case. And I think there's a special role for scientists in this equation to be able to keep reminding people about what the evidence says and what are the consequences of some of our actions.
Mm-hmm. Well, we hear about the loss of species all the time, as if we are, I mean, the word is that we're now in the 6th extinction event. And, we're not only the extinguisher, but we may be the extinguishee. And I just wonder which of the animals you're most worried about and that we need to do the most to try to intervene and protect.
Yeah, I wouldn't be able to decide that. I don't think we can intervene and protect on individual species. It has to be sort of broader systems and ecosystems, because they're all vulnerable in different ways. And if you just focus on one, some species you can focus on, and they will have what you call an umbrella effect, so that because they're so sensitive or have very wide ranging demands, that if you are successful in conserving them, it'll take care of lesser known species. And caribou are a bit in that camp. I think that's part of the reason why many of us focus on caribou, because if we're successful with caribou, then other species will be able to sort of follow along with coattails. But generally speaking, I'm worried about all of those species. So I can't think of just one that I'm more worried than others. But but I'm focusing on some more systems change where I can, because that's going to have the biggest difference.
Are you thinking in terms of preserving certain territory as, I've heard the word rewilding, and I don't know where that is planned, but also there are totally different ways of maintaining herds. I remember having dinner in a restaurant in Stockholm and ordering elk. Well, it turns out that elk are really moose. That's what they
in Europe, yeah. Same species, yeah.
Right.
So
but they seem to raise these critters, or rather, they're in the wild, but they consume them as a regular part of the diet. There's a lot of meat eating that's really elk or moose.
Okay, so rewilding is restoration, and generally speaking, you don't want to count on restoration. It's always more expensive, more intensive, less successful than keeping things in the way they are in the first place. So we ourselves don't work on rewilding and restoration very much. There are others who do that work. We are spending more of our time focused on ensuring that intact areas that have not yet had significant change are maintained, because it's much more difficult to restore ecological function, species, and so forth once they've declined or disappeared than it is to safeguard them in the first place.
So where are some of the territories that you're trying to preserve?
Well, Canada has quite a lot of intact areas in the far north in Ontario. Across the boreal systems, Arctic systems are still in good shape. There are many Indigenous communities who are interested in protection, along with some development as well. But they're shoring up these areas before change, and to limit some of the development interests that are also up there, so that they were not necessarily forced to restore them later.
Okay, but you must have opponents, and the opponents are the bad guys, like oil companies.
Yeah, I wouldn't call anybody bad guy because everybody, actually, there's a lot of great people everywhere. But it is about the difference of opinion that comes up is there's some who are quite confident that development like oil and gas and mining doesn't need to be limited, that every impact can be ameliorated. And I am less optimistic about that. So that's probably where we have a little bit of difference of opinion, or quite a bit in certain circumstances. So government is also a little bit overconfident about their ability to use the existing processes to be able to lessen impacts. In many cases, it's better to avoid the impacts in the first place. Really figure out what are the limits, and do that at appropriate scales and so on. So that's where the difference of opinion is. It's not about people.
Do you actually spend a good bit of your time doing political lobbying, trying to change the rules? Do you interact with Environment Canada's various institutions?
Yeah, scientists do generally, in the sense of we bring information to the decision-making tables. Absolutely. And so, for example, when there's a policy or something on caribou or related to a development, if we have information that's relevant for that, if we have expertise, or if we've collected information, we will make comments on it. We will meet with government officials. We're often invited to do so. So that's the kind of the information is not. We don't want it to be buried, so that it gets brought forward, and that's a pretty common role for scientists in our position, because we have quite a lot of information.
How many other scientists are involved with your organization?
We have about 50 right now, but involved on various things. But there's also scientists outside of WCS who work on related topics, and scientists are very important, generally speaking, for informing the consequences of policy decisions, and also for informing the design of them as well.
What about in academia? What's the relationship between academics, researchers, and your outfits?
Yeah, so we collaborate very closely with academic researchers. Many of us are ourselves appointed faculty. So I have adjunct positions in 3 departments in 2 universities. So that means that I help advise students, I do guest lectures and so forth. But professors have more of a burden, much more time spent on teaching and advising. Mm-hmm. And so they don't necessarily have as much time to get involved in policy, because they're working on the other aspects of academic life. But we work together with them a lot on the actual research. We have many collaborations across Canada and many universities. We also have a program in which we have research fellowships that we award to graduate students that are doing research that's similar to the types of work that we do, and that's a way of mentoring the next generation. So we've been able to support the research of over 100 graduate students in 21 universities across Canada in the last 10 years.
Perfect. Well, we hear all the time about, or maybe not enough about, the threats of loss of biodiversity. So I got the impression that everybody's losing on that front, that the game is over practically. But what I wonder is there some location where the problem is worst, or does it vary by nation in terms of how good the policies are? How would you give Canada a rating, a grade, as protecting biodiversity in comparison with some other countries? Is anybody looking at that kind of thing?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, Canada is in the middle, sometimes not very good. The thing that Canada has that many countries do not have is we have a lot of land and real estate, in the sense of, no, I shouldn't have called it real estate, but we have a lot of land and sea that hasn't yet been trammeled. We don't have too many people. So we haven't yet gotten there in the sense of and there are many European countries in particular that have a long history of development that are in way worse shape than Canada is. So we have opportunities for conservation and for safeguarding biodiversity, and the current federal government has made important commitments for more protection and to help biodiversity along with climate. But there's a lot of pressures on that have to do with the fact that we are a natural resource driven economy, and many other aspects. Our policies are not very strong by and large on biodiversity. They need to be strengthened considerably. There's too much discretion in implementing policies, and there's too much of the priority being given to economic considerations. So the reality is that our policies are not very strong and need to change.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Would you, you gave me the title of your organization, but it wasn't clear to me whether it's an NGO or a government agency. Or
no, it's a non-government. It's a non-government organization. We're called Wildlife Conservation Society Canada. WCSCanada.org is our website. And we're a non-government organization. We're a charity. But we are different from many in the sense that we don't do campaigns, or we're really an organization of scientists. So we assemble evidence and bring evidence to bear on policy and land use decisions, and we work a lot in northern areas of Canada, but also on more broadly on Canadian policies.
Thank you. This has been really enlightening. I'm much smarter today because of
well,
you.
I appreciate all your curiosity, and